Hello everyone and welcome to the Debaters Council's Motion Debrief series done for the Sri Lankan Schools Debating Championship 2025. My name is Gavin Senaratne. I am the debating coach of Visakha Vidyalaya Colombo and I am also a debater for the University of Mortua Engineering Faculty debate team. Today's motion is in post-colonial states, this house prefers an emphasis on regional and interstate identities rather than building national identities. And there's an info slide given with this, which is to say that regional and interstate identities like Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism emphasize a shared cultural, historical, or ethnic identity that transcends national borders. These movements advocate for political unity or cooperation among countries within a region, such as Arab nations or African states, based on common heritage, language, or struggle against colonialism or imperialism. Um, so the first thing, like the first issue that I have with this motion is with regards to what the actual effect that this motion will have on the world is. Um, because it's not immediately clear to me whether having interstate identities as opposed to regional identities will actually result in the end of conflict. And the reason I say this is because conflict to a large extent in these areas is primarily due to like land disputes or like due to disputes over water, because you have rivers and you need to distribute the water among each other and people need water to live, and things like that. So it's immediately unclear to me why exactly interstate identities as opposed to national identities will be beneficial in terms of stopping conflict. So let's try to unravel that first and look at what the key differences are with each side. Mm, and identifying the differences between these two things in a this house prefers motion is really important. And when I mean differences, I don't mean just like arbitrary differences, because I mean, of course, regional identities and national identities are different. One is national, one is regional. That's pretty obvious. But what I mean by this is that what are the impactful differences? What are the differences that actually make a change in how people behave, or in how people are affected by these national identities? Mm, so the first thing that we have regarding national identities is that they are somewhat arbitrary and they are influenced to a large extent by colonialism. What do I mean by this? So in these countries, prior to colonialism and prior to imperialism, there weren't really nations as such, and rather what it was people living in tribes and colonies and things like that, just roaming through these areas. There were no clearly defined borders. There were kingdoms at various points in time, but those just rose and fell. So there was no like proper borders or proper nations within these regions. And so one sort of assertion or assumption that you can make is that since these national identities are arbitrary and colonially determined, they are more likely to lead to conflict. And you can try to prove that later on in the debate. The second question is about, okay, so how are interstate identities different from national identities, right? And the key difference is that interstate identities are not arbitrary, which is that it is undeniable that, African people are African, that they originate from the continent of Africa. It is undeniable that Arab people are Arab. It's a specific region that is sort of independent of perhaps the South Indian, of the South Asian and Indian subcontinent region, or it is distinct from like the Levant or the Turkey, Lebanon, Greece sort of region. So therefore, the identities of these regions are extremely clearly defined, and so therefore they're not arbitrary. And secondly, these people have like a very common history, like because colonialism affected all of them equally, and so they can like bond over that when they get into it. So this is the key difference between interstate and national identities. And sort of the issue with this motion is that if you don't know the regional history and the context of sort of Arab nations or African nations, then you might as well just give up at that point if your opposition knows better than you. Because it's very hard for you to get into the debate or even start to make a case without knowing all of this information beforehand. So let's get into like the prop and op cases and try and figure out what the cases should look like. Um, what I'll try to do here is I'll try to minimize the influence of specific knowledge about these regions when I'm making the arguments and when I'm walking you through the cases. But it is extremely important in the context of this motion. This is very spec heavy motion, so it will be unavoidable. Now, First, the first issue that we have here is it's very hard to prove the impacts of national identities. Like, for example, does it have an impact on conflict? Does it have an impact on how people develop their personal identities? Does it have an impact on religion, culture, and these other things that lead to conflict? These are all assertions that you can make, but they're very hard to prove realistically. But let's go about it. So, firstly, for proposition, I think the most obvious claim that you're supposed to make, and that's basically given to you in the motion, is that there is going to be a lack of international conflicts. Um, and while I previously mentioned that international conflicts are often due to border disputes or land disputes or disputes over water or other kinds of shared resources, there is also an ideological element to most disputes, right? If there is a war happening somewhere, it is not purely because of the river or the land or something, but there is an ideological aspect to it as well. So, what you can argue is that when you have interstate identities, you are less likely to have international conflicts because now these nations share common identity, so that ideological sort of abrasiveness between the two nations is gone because they have a common identity. And this is where like some contextualization or mechanization is very important, because when you say this house prefers an emphasis on regional and interstate identities, um, who is emphasizing this, right, is the question that you have. And it is likely that what the motion is suggesting is that this is being pushed by states. So states themselves or the governments of these countries emphasize these regional identities, and they sort of neglect the concept of building national identities in favor of that. And I'm assuming it's granted for you that all countries are going to be willing to engage in this, um, since it's this house prefers motion. So that's first thing about international conflict reduction. The second idea then could be about inter-ethnic conflict reduction as well, because it's not only nations that are fighting against each other, but it's also different ethnicities within these nations that are fighting against each other as well. And again, there's a huge problem here, right? Because I mean, a lot of people think that their ethnic rights are undermined when nations are formed, um, instead of them being able to live in their like traditional tribes or things like that. And so, as a consequence of that, there is a lot of inter-ethnic conflict happening in these regions because certain ethnicities have a certain amount of power, but they're trying to claim disproportionate amounts of power that are not like in line with the population of those ethnicities. There are instances where sizable minorities are just completely disenfranchised, such as like the Tigray conflict in Ethiopia, for example. But these are certain examples of conflicts that you might have within these areas. And what you can argue is that having interstate identities lessens the extent of these interethnic conflicts, because your ethnicity sort of takes a second place in comparison to the broad interstate or regional identity that, the Pan-African or Pan-Arabian identity. Now, why is this distinct from national identities, right? Because you could also build the exact same argument saying that your national identity supersedes your ethnic identity, and therefore, as a consequence of that, you won't have ethnic conflict anymore. This ties back to the question of arbitrariness, which is that the very creation of a nation itself is arbitrary and can be tied to colonialism and can be rejected on that grounds. But you being African is inherently something that is a consequence of like your genetics or your birthplace and things like that. So it's an undeniable fact as opposed to an arbitrarily defined concept of a nation. So that's possibly why the interstate identity would be more successful at taking precedence over the ethnic identity compared to the national identity, which would likely be overwhelmed by this sense of an ethnic identity. The third idea then, and this is also a bit specific to these regions because they mention Africa and the Arab region, which is regarding terrorism. Um, and the argument that I'm trying to make here is that having interstate identities helps you address terrorism much better, because once again, when you break down the ideological barrier between nations, it becomes easier for them to cooperate to address terrorism. So obviously there's the question of self-interest, and states will band together to address terrorism even if you have ideological differences. But not having ideological differences and having a common identity just makes it much easier. And that's sort of the delta that you argue on. So that pretty much covers it for the prop side of things. And I understand that none of these arguments seem particularly concrete, which is that the correlation between having an interstate identity or regional identity and the benefits that are being claimed in the case are not very direct, but that's the nature of the motion, right? It's very hard to prove impacts of a specific identity aside from like traditional arguments about identity and how you feel about your identity. But given that the motion is about conflict resolution, I am assuming that that's the argument, that's the sort of line of argumentation that was expected when it was set. Okay, so this brings us to the op case as well. So what can op say in response to the sort of benefits regarding conflict reduction that come from proposition? I think the first most obvious thing is that you flip the argument on inter-ethnic conflict reduction to say that ethnic identities are going to be undermined when you have these regional or interstate identities, and they're going to be undermined to a greater extent than they would have been in a world where you had only national identities. So what does this look like? Again, let's go to the example of like the Tigray people in Ethiopia, or for example, let's take something else like the Kurdish people in the Arab region. So they're distributed between a bunch of countries, but let's take the Kurdish people broadly, right? If you're within a nation and you're a significant minority of the nation, and the national identity is already being called into question, and it's not considered legitimate, you can fight better for specific rights and freedoms, or you can fight for your ethnic identity to play a larger role in the broader national identity. And what I mean by that is that you get to have a say in how the national identity is shaped, if your country is developing a national identity. However, if there's like a regional or interstate identity being developed, it's very unlikely that you get to have a say in it, and that might end up undermining your own ethnic identity, and that might eventually result in the denial of specific rights or freedoms, such as like land rights or rights to practice certain cultural practices that you might have, or certain, and it might result in like the infringement of certain freedoms that you might have, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the first argument that you want to make about ethnic identities. And again, this is like a classic parallel to sort of the nationalism debate, which is that, again, one benefit of nationalism is that it supersedes all other identities and takes precedence over them. But one of the drawbacks of it is that it also ends up undermining those same identities, which might be more important than nationalism to an individual. So that's something that you can argue in this context as well. But the second argument that I want to make for opposition is when you consider the broad idea of like a regional or interstate identity, you've got to ask yourself who shapes that identity, right? Who decides what constitutes a regional or interstate identity? Who decides what Pan-Africanism means? Who decides what Pan-Arabism means? And it is more likely that the larger or wealthier nations in these regions are going to be the people who dominate the discourse on how this regional or interstate identity is shaped. And we already see this to a certain extent in like the ECOWAS, which is like the Western African countries, where Nigeria is by far the largest country out of the lot, and therefore a lot of the discourse surrounding like national identity, or even like sort of economic dealings within this region or within this group, are dictated to a large extent by the Nigerian government. And that's because it's simply a larger nation, and therefore, as a consequence of being a larger nation, it has a bigger voice. So the same logic can be applied here for shaping like regional or interstate identities, which is that the largest or the most populous and the wealthiest nations are going to dominate the discourse on how this identity is shaped. And again, that's going to lead to these ethnic identities or even like national identities of smaller nations being undermined. So the first like sort of argument that you want to make is on a sub-national scale, which is that ethnicities or ethnic identities are undermined and they end up losing out of their rights. And sort of the second argument that you want to make is on a large scale, which is that entire nations themselves could end up having their identities undermined or losing their rights or whatever. due to the formation of these regional or interstate identities. So that pretty much wraps everything I have to say about this motion. Um, the key thing here is that you will sort of know the arguments that you're supposed to make if you know the context of these regions. But if you don't know the context of these regions, it's a very, very difficult motion to do. And you'll probably just end up confusing yourself, the judge, and the other side. So that's pretty much all I have. If you all have any questions regarding the motion, please make sure to drop them down in the comments down below. And yeah, that pretty much wraps up everything from me. We hope to see you again with the next videos.